Hi, everyone. Welcome to our group presentation. We will be going over the effects of video self-evaluation on the effects of video self-evaluation on skill acquisition with yoga postures by Downs, Miltenberg, Bedronsky, and Witherspoon, 2015. I want to start off by doing a couple of introductions. First, we have Denai Pacheco.
Hi.
Denai will be going over the purpose of the study. And then we have me. I'm Tiffany Burden. I will be going over the supporting literature and original study review. Next, we have Bonnie Ladig.
Hi.
Bonnie will be going over the definition section of the method section and the conclusions, as well as Jessica Anderson.
Hello.
Jessica will be going over the participants, the setting, the materials, and the data collection. Then we have Rebecca Barton.
Hi.
Rebecca will be going over the design, the baseline and treatment, the IOA, and treatment integrity sections. And then last but not least, we have Bethany and Nan.
Hi.
And Bethany will be going over the limitations of our study. Also, everybody will be presenting on the results of their individual graphs. So now on to our presentation. All right, so for our original study, the participants were 2 university students from the University of South Florida. They are Bill, who is 21, and Tom, who is 24. They both have no experience with yoga, but they wanted to learn. The materials used for this study was some technology for being able to record and play back each of the yoga poses and a yoga mat. The yoga poses that were collected for this presentation, I'm not going to attempt to say the names. So we have the tree pose, the warrior pose 2, and the downward facing dog pose. These were the 3 poses that data was collected on for this study. For data collection, they scored each pose using the task analysis that was created. The poses were supposed to be held for at least 30 seconds to be able to be counted as correct. For the inter-observer agreement, trial-by-trial inter-observer agreement was collected, and this was done by a blind observer. They collected this IOA data for 33% of the sessions. The social validity, so two certified yoga instructors that had no idea what was going on with the experimental conditions used a 5-point scale to rate the quality of the poses. This 5-point scale was along the lines of, did they have correct posture? Did they have the flow, and etc. So they had absolutely no idea anything that was in the task analyses. And then treatment integrity was calculated by collecting the percentage of the agreement on performance of the steps in the task analyses as the participants conducted the video self-evaluation. So somebody was collecting percentage based off of what they did for that. The next part is the procedure part. Just to start out, a multiple baseline across behaviors was used. So across each of the poses, they did a multiple baseline design. For baseline, the researcher, the person that was actually conducting the study, acted as the model in the first 2 sessions. Then for the video self-evaluation portion, the participants viewed their poses on the video immediately after they had participated in the pose and evaluated the pose by using the task analysis to score each of the steps. So they recorded if it was correct or incorrect based off of what was on the TA. There was also a video feedback portion. This was only done if minor improvement was shown from the baseline to the treatment. This wasn't collected for every single participant. So then we have the maintenance section, and maintenance was collected after 5 weeks for Bill and for Tom. Oh, 2 weeks for Tom. This was after everything in the intervention was removed. And then based off of the results for the study, the video self-evaluation resulted in a major increase in the percentage of correct steps for 5 of the 6 poses across the two participants. All right, and now for the supporting literature. So I'm going to go over a couple of studies. The first study was collected by Miltenberger, Botch, and Fogel, 2009. This was video modeling by experts with video feedback to enhance gymnastic skills. So for this study, 4 female competitive gymnasts, ages 7 to 10, the study was collected over them. So the target behaviors was a backward giant circle to a handstand or a giant, a kip cast, and a clear hip circle. This was done on the uneven bars as well. For the data collection, data was collected using a 28-item checklist for each skill. So each component was scored as either correct or incorrect, and the percentage was created from the correct or incorrect. For the baseline data was collected for each 3 of the skills under the normal practice conditions. So nothing else was done. They were just taking videos of them completing these. For the treatment section, video modeling by experts with video feedback was done. After the gymnast performed the target skill, she would walk to the computer, and then the computer technician would tell her, try to match the expert gymnast on the left. So she was able to watch an expert gymnast on the left and then was able to learn from that. The results of this study. So the exposure to the intervention improved the skill performance more quickly than regular practice and coaching alone. So if they saw somebody, they were improving a lot faster. And the next study that was done was the effects of a videotape feedback package on the peer interactions of children with serious behavioral and emotional challenges. This was done by Kern Dunlap et al., 1992. This study was collected on 5 boys ranging from 11 to 13 years old, and they were all enrolled in grades 4, 5, and 6. These participants all had behavioral and emotional challenges as well, and were in a self-contained classroom. So the target behaviors for this study was all verbal and nonverbal interactions towards peers, so anything. This was particularly desirable peer interactions and undesirable peer interactions. That's things such as, hey, you're doing great, and then things that could even be like a frown. It could be nonverbal and verbal. The data collection was frequency. The frequency counts were used to assess the number of interactions during daily activity sessions. Baseline for the study, the activity sessions were recorded using a camcorder on the tripod in the corner of the room. So they just put a tripod with the camcorder in the side of the room and then just press record. For the treatment, video feedback sessions. So the students viewed approximately about 10 minutes of the videotape from the activity sessions and the ones that were held from the previous day. This videotape was stopped following each 30-second interval, and the students were asked to respond to the statement, I had desirable peer interactions, with a yes or a no. And this response was recorded on a self-assessment sheet. And the results from this study, the feedback procedures that resulted in reduced undesirable peer interactions. So the undesirable peer interactions went down for all the students involved.
Hello. So the purpose of our study was to determine the effectiveness of video self-evaluation on the accuracy of yoga poses. Yoga performed properly may produce many health benefits, such as increased flexibility, reduced stress, increased muscle strength, muscular endurance, and cardiorespiratory endurance. Now, yoga poses performed incorrectly may increase the risk of injuries. This is why promoting the practice of yoga in the correct poses is so important. By learning yoga poses with a task analysis, video recording ourselves, and then using the task analysis to grade our performance, we promote the correct practice of yoga. Feedback by a coach or instructor may sometimes be limited, and therefore, by learning the self evaluation method, we require less time and dependency from a coach. Learning to do things independently is always beneficial. Meanwhile, the improvements we see may function as our reinforcement. The accuracy of our yoga poses substantially increased with the use of the task analysis and self-recording evaluation.
Okay, this study included 6 participants with varied levels of yoga experience. Most of the participants rated themselves as beginners, with one participant rating themselves at an intermediate level. Participants were all graduate students at Ball State University and enrolled in SPCE 611 for the fall 2018 semester. Participants were all female and ranged in age from 23 to 30. The setting for the study, participants conducted each yoga session within their own home. Areas that had more open space were used most frequently, such as the living room or the backyard. Materials needed included a camera or computer with video recording available, a yoga mat, yoga visuals for each pose, which are included later on in the presentation, and a yoga pose task analysis for each pose.
So each of our poses was given a definition based off of an image of that yoga pose. So for the first pose was a warrior pose, the act of positioning one's body with hips lifted high off the ground, feet and hands flat with fingers spaced apart. Feet should be approximately shoulder width apart, legs are straight, and one's body should be positioned at about a 90-degree angle. A non-example would be keeping knees on the ground. And this is the image that was used to create that definition for warrior pose. Our second definition is for tree pose. It is the act of balancing on one leg with the other leg positioned so that the foot is flat against the inner side of the leg being balanced upon. Arms are stretched out over the individual's head, slightly bent at the elbow, with palms flat together. A non-example would be balancing on one leg with arms up without bringing the second foot to the inside of the leg. And this is the image used to create that definition. And finally, we have the definition for downward facing dog. This is the act of positioning one's body so that the individual is standing with the right foot behind them, foot facing to the outside of their body. The front foot is farther out in front of the body, facing forward, and the front leg is bent at the knee without making contact to the ground. Torso should be facing forward with the front leg, and arms should be straight out from the individual. The right arm should be held straight behind while the left is straight ahead in front. And then that is the final image used to create the definition, and these images were also used as reference points during our baseline.
Jessica, I'm going to unmute you for the data collection section.
All right, data will be collected for each of the 3 different poses using the task analysis. Each step on the task analysis will be scored as correct or incorrect. Data will then be scored using percentage of correct steps out of the total number of steps for each pose. Each pose had about 10 to 14 steps with them. To calculate the percentage, each individual will divide the number of correct steps by the total number of steps for one session, and then multiply that number by 100.
As mentioned before, the study that we used did consist of a multiple baseline across behavior design. So baseline was taken on each pose until the scores allowed for intervention to begin, and then baseline was continued on each pose following until we implemented intervention for that pose. For our baseline, participants were to watch one YouTube video for each pose before completing their baseline data, just to have a basic understanding of how to do the pose. We also used those images that Bonnie showed earlier, and there was no feedback given during baseline. And each pose consisted for at least 5 sessions, and once stable was when we began intervention. Our treatment phases, we used the task analysis. Each individual scored their own task analysis after completing a session. One session consisted of 3 poses, and once an intervention, the pose was recorded and participants self-evaluated their pose using task analysis. Correct response would be completing each task in the task analysis and holding the pose for 30 seconds. And an error on any step in the task analysis or not holding for 30 seconds was an incorrect response. For our IOA and treatment integrity, participants were paired up to complete their IOA data. Each participant sent 2 random session videos to her partner for her partner to score using the task analysis. Task analysis were scored and sent back to each partner. IOA was scored by dividing numbers of agreed responses by total number of responses to ensure treatment integrity. IOA partners compared their IOA after sessions. So we have our lowest IOA score seemed to be 65, and we ranged all the way up to 100.
For my graph, I had my baseline for the downward dog ranging between 67 and 75%, and my average was 75%. For the intervention, my range is from 83% to 100%, and that pretty much is the same pattern for the warrior pose and the tree pose, where baseline was pretty low, and then the intervention increase in the accuracy of those yoga poses.
I saw a lot of the same results as Denai when I went through my baseline and intervention phases. So for downward facing dog, my baseline was about, the range was between 36 and 72%, with an average of 56. And then with the implementation of the TA, my range went up to about 81 to 100%, with an average of 95%. The only one where I really saw a good bit of variability with the implementation of the TA was the tree pose, where my range was between 91 and 100, and it just wasn't quite as stable at 100% as the others were.
All right, and just like everybody else, mine looks very similar. For the baseline for the warrior pose, if you all can see too, we all did different variations of these graphs. So some people started with tree pose, some people started with warrior pose, and some people started with the downward dog. So I started with the warrior pose, and my range was 64 to 86% for the baseline for the warrior pose. This average was 76%, so it was below that 80% line, which meant that I still needed some intervention. For the intervention for the warrior pose, I had about 86 to 100% range for the intervention right here, and a 98% average for that intervention. Same for baseline for the downward dog. It was a lot lower than 80% for sure, so I definitely needed some intervention. I had a 69% average for the downward dog, and then the intervention, it went up to a 90%. Same with baseline for the tree pose. I had about a 78% average for the baseline, and then it went up to a 92% for intervention.
As for my baseline and interventions, I started with downward dog, and then I went to tree pose and warrior pose. I had never done yoga before, so my scores are very low. It was a new experience for me. I averaged for my downward dog 57 in baseline. Tree was 76, and baseline for warrior pose was an average of 38%. And once I started intervention on each pose, I did see a pretty big increase in my scores, with my average for downward dog being 91, and intervention tree being 92, and warrior being an average of 83.
Okay, so these are my graphs. During the baseline for downward facing dog, I had a range of 42 to 83%, and the average percent was 55%. I noticed that with this particular pose, it was very difficult for me to keep my feet flat on the floor. So I think that kind of affected my score in baseline, and then also during the intervention. So then moving on, in the intervention for downward facing dog, I ended up averaging at 86%. And then with the warrior pose, my average for baseline was 63%, and then it moved up to 89%. And then for the tree pose, I went from 60% to 95%, which was the highest score that I got for any of the poses.
Okay, fortunately for our study, I also saw the similar results. And after the intervention, I saw an increase in all of the poses. For the tree pose, in baseline, I was averaging an 86%, and once intervention was implemented, it increased to 100%. For the warrior pose, in baseline, I had an average of 63%. After the intervention, that went up to 89%. And then same for baseline, the average was 83% and increased to 95%.
So to conclude, throughout the course of our study, participants self-evaluated 3 different yoga poses: the tree pose, the warrior pose, and downward facing dog. Participants recorded themselves on video in order to self-evaluate each pose. Participants based these poses in baseline off of images as well as videos on YouTube for each pose, and during treatment phases implemented a task analysis for each pose separately. Upon implementation of TAs, participants saw an increase in performance across all 3 poses across 15 sessions. In order to ensure treatment fidelity, IOA data was collected in pairs among the 6 participants and reported back to their individual partners. 2 random videos were chosen, as mentioned earlier, and sent to partners for the collection of IOA data.
All right, I'm going to briefly talk about the limitations of both the original study and our personal study, or our replication of the original study. So while the results of this intervention were effective both in the original study and then with our own personal results, the study referenced one limitation that they found. In this original study, the participants had to be retrained on the self-evaluation process as their treatment fidelity was lacking. With video recordings and self-evaluation through task analyses, it can be simple to kind of fudge the scoring on the task analysis to see what an individual wants to see. And it makes sense that we all want to see ourselves make progress, even when this may not be true progress. So it helps us feel better about ourselves. But this was the one limitation that the study listed that they had found. And then another limitation that we found when we replicated this study was that the article didn't specify a schedule that was used regarding how often the sessions were conducted. So if the sessions were conducted consecutively every day, results of this study may have shown greater outcomes. Whereas if the sessions were conducted more sporadically, the results may have been poorer. So personally, I'm not a very fit person, and I found that the poses were more difficult to perform with accuracy when there had been a day or a few days between my sessions. Whereas if I did them back to back, it was a little bit easier to perform the poses correctly. Some of the people in our group have also had exposure to yoga prior to beginning the study, and these participants may have already been more apt to perform the yoga poses at a higher score on the task analysis prior to beginning the study. So we may have had a better resemblance of the original study results if each of us had chosen yoga poses that we were not familiar with, as the poses used in this study are more common in beginner yoga classes or videos that you might do on YouTube. And then in addition, we had some time constraints that affected our ability to conduct the maintenance phase of the original study. So that also was a limitation for our replication.
All right, everyone, this concludes our presentation. We're going to show some slides of our references that were used. We have the supporting literature listed on here, as well as the original study. And then the next slide is going to just briefly go over the contributions that were made to the PowerPoint. This is basically in the order that we went in. So if anybody is wanting to know what somebody did, the contributions are also listed here. But all in all, this concludes everything. And thank you all so much for listening to our replication. This was fun.